and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today's video will be a countdown of the top champions for rank play in patch 11.7. This patch didn't bring a whole lot of changes as most of the meta shifts have happened because of the 11.6b patch. But the important thing here is that there has been a shift in the meta with Slayer falling down ever so slightly in priority. So even though our top 10 will look familiar, those shifts in the meta will be reflected here. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. As not that much has changed from 11.6 to 11.7, there's a lot of familiar faces in today's top 10, which includes Tristana returning as the number 10 champion. Tristana continues to hold the title of best one-cost unit in the current meta. There's certainly other contenders, but none of them can carry the early game quite as well as Tristana. And after some buffs, Tristana 3 has made a comeback, though only in rare circumstances. Overall, Tristana is a champion you can reliably transition from in multiple comps. This is due to the items on her being flexible, such as Aurelion, which can pivot towards Kennen and Keeper, or Jeweled Gauntlet, which can later go on an Aurelion Soul. Of course, there's the most common transition, which is playing Spirit Sharpshooter, where you transfer the items on Tristana over to Sivir. Or you can keep playing her as the primary carry if you can 3-star her. The amount of damage she does during the early rounds mixed with the flexible items makes Tristana an easy pick for our top 10. Another returning face is Kennen, who comes in at number 9. Kennen is back thanks mostly because of how well keepers are doing in the meta. But we don't want to sell Kennen short here as he's an all-around solid 3-cost champion. Players that find him early can use him as a main damage dealer and frontliner for the early stages of the game, especially with items like Aurelion and Guardian Angel. From there, you can easily transition into a full keeper comp or continue to use Kennen as part of your frontline until selling him later on. Kennen has a lot going for him. Consistently good damage, AoE crowd control, and high survivability between keeper shields, and most players always run Guardian Angel on him. While his presence is felt most in the mid game during stages 3 and 4, he does scale well into the late game if you're able to 3-star. Kennen is just an all-around great champion. And a new face this week, though we have seen her on this list before, is Nico, who comes in at number 8. It's been a bit since we've last had Nico in our top 10, but she's returned with a vengeance after well-timed buffs to her in 11.6b patch. With her damage buff, she's a lot more consistent as the main source of damage for Vanguard Mystic Fabled. That composition as a whole is doing a lot better in the current meta after it began to struggle, especially after Vanguard was nerfed a few times. But the composition is back, and so is Nico. Unfortunately, Nico really has no place outside of the Vanguard Mystic composition. She can be used as a carry during stage 3 and parts of stage 4, but only if you manage to 2-star her easily. Nico's problem is how much of her kit is tied to being a Fabled, which is a persistent issue for Fable as a whole. Without the extra damage gained from Fabled, she just isn't consistent enough to be a reliable mid-game carry. That said, she's great with Fabled and as the carry for Vanguard Mystic. Just keep in mind that if you're wanting to use Nico, it has to be in that build, and that build alone. Next up, we have Olaf coming in at number 7. Slayer is still one of the best synergies and compositions in the game, but we've seen it begin to struggle, particularly for its 2 4-cost carries, Olaf and Tryndamere. Tryndamere can still do well, but of the two, it's Olaf that manages to hold the torch for Slayers. But even Olaf has problems carrying. Without good items, a strong board, and Olaf too, he's just not quite up to the same level of dominance he was in previous metas. Part of that is due to minor nerfs, but also the shifting of the meta. Quite a few compositions hit their stride earlier than Olaf can come online, so players running Olaf with Slayers tend to get punished during stage 4 and 5. Only when Olaf 2 is hit and the rest of the board is upgraded does Slayer kick in and dominate like before. Overall though, Olaf is a top tier late game carry. Just keep in mind you may struggle to do well with him if you try to force Olaf too early in the game. Having a strong frontline is important, which is why we have Shen coming in as our frontline representation as the number 6 champion. The meta has slowly shifted back towards Shen with Adept as the best frontline available. Vanguard is still in the running and Brawler does well early game, but neither are quite up to par with Shen, at least in the current meta. There's 2 main reasons for this shift in the meta. First is nerfs to Vanguard, which have slowly lowered their value. Second is the prevalence of Last Whisper on a lot of carries. Since it naturally counters Vanguard, we've seen players shift towards Shen since the armor reduction, while noticeable, matters less for Shen since he's inherently harder to kill than most Vanguard units. And lastly, the value of Adept has gone up, especially towards the late game, with Shen and Yone being a great pair of champions to use as your front line. Combine all of these factors together and it should make a lot of sense as to why Shen is in our top 10. Up next, we have Lee Sin coming in as the number 5 champion. Lee Sin is back once again, but we've lowered his position on the list slightly to reflect the current meta. Of course, he's still doing well as a late game champion, but with kill compositions falling a bit out of favor, we're seeing Lee Sin played less. Along with that, we're not seeing duelists do all that well, same with Tryndamere and Slayers. Put all those together, and there's less of a reason for players to prioritize putting Lee Sin into their comp. That said, Lee Sin is ridiculously good as a standalone champ. The fact that he can instantly win you a fight with a well-placed kick cannot be understated. Execute-like abilities never feel fair and can swing unwinnable fights into wins, so Lee Sin will always have a place in the meta for the rest of set 4. Alright, for the number 4 champion, we're finally going to acknowledge Xayah. We've put Xayah aside several times because champions like Kennen and Kale felt more impactful than her. Xayah was just a hype man to the other champions. We're at the point in the meta where Xayah is an essential champ. Granted, she is mostly essential to Keeper, but since Keepers are doing so well, we've brought Xayah into the convo. And for good reason, since she's an important part to the Keeper comp. Not only as a damage dealer, but the fact that she survives until the end of the fight and usually guarantees a win because of her ability. Unfortunately, she doesn't have much of a role outside of the comp, as she's still just a trait bot for Executioner in Kale builds, and Elderwood is still not doing all that well in the current meta. Still, Xayah is the key to the successes of Keepers, and we want to acknowledge that importance with having her in the top 10. Next up is the best 4-cost carry in the game, coming in at number 3, Aurelion Sol. Step aside Kale, Slayers, and Xayah as the Space Dragon is here to assert his dominance. There's no other 4-cost carry that can do what Aurelion Sol can, and that's carry as a 1-star champ. A lot of that does have to do with items and the mage trade, but running Aurelion Sol as a 1-star is not a detriment. Because of how his ability functions with mage and the amount of damage he does baseline, Aurelion is just fine as a 1-star unit. Sure, you're going to need to 2-star him at some point or else you get outscaled, but a current issue in the meta, at least for 4-cost carries, is that they come online too late. Aurelion, though, bypasses that issue and can be tossed into a composition right away, which allows that player to be more greedy with their gold. This means Mage as a composition is more consistent all game than, say, Slayer or Kale. Aurelion also scales well into the late game, so we have no qualms whatsoever with calling him the best 4-cost carry in the current meta. Our last 2 champions are late game monsters, starting with Swain, who comes in at number 2. Once you've hit the late game, the chances are you're going to see multiple players contesting Swain. Why is that? Well, for starters, his traits are great in the late game. Dragon Soul pairs with Olaf, Shyvana, and Aurelion Sol, all of which can be used as main carries in the late game. Siphoner, which is his other trait, is easy to splash into other compositions to provide a small amount of healing, which can be enough to win rounds. Another reason is that Swain is a fantastic frontline champion. Thanks to his ultimate where he transforms, he gains a lot of health and does alright damage. That damage then translates into healing, which in turn makes him harder to kill. This is made even more apparent in mage compositions, where a player has a mage hat for Swain as he gains even more health from double casting his ability. All in all, if you're looking to upgrade your late game board, tossing in a Swain to bolster your frontline is always worth it. And the number 1 champion for today's top 10 is Samira. This should not come as a surprise since Samira is still wrecking the late game. She just does so much damage that any player that 2-stars her has an easy route to the top 4. That's how strong Samira is in the late game. Really, there's not a whole lot else for us to talk about with Samira. She's saving Slayer as a whole because transitioning into her as the main carry with Slayer is easy to do. Sure, you do have to 2-star her at some point, but overall, her damage is plenty enough at 1-star as long as you transfer items over to her. No other late game champion holds a candle to her damage output besides maybe a 3-star 4-cost unit. And that's going to be our top 10 champions for patch 11.7. But before we go, we have a few honorable mentions to cover. These are champions that are doing well but lack consistency or have specific issues that hold them back from being in the top 10. Our first honorable mention is Ornn. We decided to bump Ornn down to an honorable mention because even though his artifacts are impactful, Ornn as a champion is not. But we can't deny that artifacts are an essential part of the late game meta, so we still recommend running Ornn when possible to get at least 1 artifact on your board. Next, we have another Vanguard to talk about with Sejuani. Vanguards may have issues against champions running Last Whisper, but Sejuani is still one of the best frontline options in the meta. For the most part, you can just run her as a standalone champion because of her crowd control. But since Vanguards have taken a hit, we're keeping Sejuani as an honorable mention, at least for now. And our last honorable mention is Yone. Yone struggled a lot in set 4.5, but after several buffs over the course of multiple patches, he's finally back to being a great option for the late game. Sadly, he doesn't compare to Samira or Swain, but he still has a place in the late game meta, specifically with Shen, since the depth has risen up in value. It's unlikely we'll ever see Yone return to his former glory during the first half of set 4, but at least he's in a balanced state for the end of the set. Alright folks, that's all we have for you for today. Overall, the meta is in a great place with Slayers not being as dominant as they were previously. Of course, the top compositions are still basically the same, but at least there's more competition between those builds and the mid-tier builds. And because of that, there's a lot of viable champions to choose from, which is great to see. Let us know in the comment section below if there's any champion you think deserved to be on our list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for your Giant Slayer TFT videos.